are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about the mother and housewife turned cannibal. Now this one is a solved case, but it is a rough case, and I do want to just warn you that it is very graphic, and if you cannot handle that mentally or stomach it, it's totally okay. If you still want to watch true crime, there are other on my channel, or you can just go watch, a Disney movie or something and keep your spirits high, but it is definitely more brutal than some can be. Although you guys know that I don't like to, go into detail about the super brutal things, and I never show any sort of pictures of horrid crime scene photos or anything like that. So I'll just let you decide, but I did just want to warn you. And by the way, if you don't know, it is my absolute passion to share these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you would like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and then leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2000 in Australia, and the Price family lived in Aberdeen in New South Wales, and this was actually John and Katherine who lived with their children. Now this was kind of a mixed family of sorts. They had met at a club when John was already a divorcee, and he also had two older children who were still living with him. And Katherine at this point, I believe, had 4 children. So they had a pretty big household together. John himself was a 45-year-old successful miner and a wonderful father, and he and his ex-wife were actually still friends, and that was just because she said that John was still a really great guy and that everyone around him who knew him loved him. He was the type of person who made his happiness and everyone else's happiness a priority. He didn't let hate consume him. He just wanted to go through life in the most positive way possible. There was no sense to him in just drowning in negativity. And Katherine, his wife, or his new girlfriend actually I should say, because they weren't married yet, she was actually the complete opposite, and they were opposite in looks. Katherine was a redhead and John had super dark hair. They actually met and moved in together around 1995. 5 years later, it was now February 30th of 2000, and John actually didn't show up to work that day at his mining business, and all of his coworkers were really close to him. Like I said, he was just the type of guy everyone liked, and so they instantly knew that he needed to be reported missing, because he wasn't there, and he was always early, even if he had gone out drinking the night before. So they reported him missing, and at the same time, a neighbor also called the police because they had realized that John's car was still in the driveway, and he normally wasn't home, and they were the type that were like very close. They would check in on each other just to make sure that they were okay. So the neighbor had gone over to his home and kind of knocked on the door, called out, no one was answering, and that's when they saw blood on the doorknob, and they decided that they should probably call the police for that. The police couldn't get anyone to respond either, and they eventually forced their way into the home, where they found a woman sleeping. She was on the bed, she was snoring, and that's how they found her, and they didn't see John anywhere. And they could smell a faint smell of like a homemade meal, a stew of some sort, and they thought maybe he was in the kitchen cooking. Unfortunately, that was not the case. They tried to wake Katherine, but she was not coming to, and when she did, she would still say that she had no memory of what had happened. The search of the rest of the home would provide pretty much all the answers that the police needed, because they went into the kitchen and they did find John. But he wasn't cooking. Well, technically he was, because in a pot on the stove was vegetables and his head. And there were also plates on the table that were filled with meat, this stew substance. And there were name cards attached to each plate, one for each of his kids. At this point, investigators didn't want to believe what their experience was telling them was happening here, and I mean, this was a horror movie in front of their eyes. It's not something that the investigators were just, going into a normal day and finding. This was something that was in a horror movie that was suddenly in front of them. It was found that John Price had been made into a meal for his kids to eat, and possibly his own girlfriend had done it. There was remnants of another plate that had been made, and the rest of it was thrown outside in the grass, but it was thought that Katherine had eaten some of it. This was a meal of potato, pumpkin, beets, zucchini, cabbage, squash, gravy, and her own boyfriend. She was found to have taken a bunch of pills the night before, and she was in a comatose. She would not even come to. However, they did, I think, pump her stomach, and they got her to come to, and she was either faking amnesia or she really did have it from all the pills she took, because she couldn't tell them anything that happened the night prior. The news of this horrific crime scene spread through the country, and it was huge news in the media, of course, because that sounds like such a, dramatic title. And, just like on YouTube with clickbait, that's how journalists do too. And so they did spread the story a lot. Unfortunately, that meant that lots of people who shouldn't be reading about it were, including young children. And even the officers who were grown had a horrible time with this. A lot of them refused to eat meat after this, after seeing what was on those plates. A lot of them had to take time off. And they also had a ton of officers who quit right after this. So the new investigators were now the ones who had to interrogate this woman who might have done this horrific thing. And nobody even wanted to come in contact with her. They were all terrified of her. After doing some digging, investigators found that John had been telling his coworkers that if anything had happened to him, that Katherine had done it. And he was also saying that earlier that month, they had gotten into a fight, and basically it ended with Katherine trying to stab him with a butcher knife, and this started to occur more frequently throughout that month, and he would actually end up calling his friends, his family, his coworkers to just tell them what was going on so they were in the know, so they could basically, back him up that this was happening, because we'll get into a little later why he couldn't just go to the police. But he did end up going to the court system, and he wanted to get a restraining order against Katherine so his own kids would be safe. And unfortunately, this would not be done in time before he was killed. The autopsy showed that John had been stabbed possibly over 37 times, and when they tried to piece together what happened that night, they knew that John had come home and he checked in with one of his neighbors, as he often did, and at this point he also went inside and decided to go to bed. It was like 11 p.m. and so he pretty much, had dinner, got into bed, and then a little while later his girlfriend would come home and she would make her own dinner, she would shower, and she would go into the bedroom. But she wanted, sexual experience that night, and so they did so, and John fell back asleep. And that is when he would wake up to Katherine on top of him. John knew that Katherine had some anger and violence issues, but he had no idea that it could get to this level, even though he had mentally kind of prepared himself and known that deep down he didn't want to acknowledge it, especially when he couldn't do anything about it right at that moment. And at this point, he would be brutally attacked by a butcher knife that Katherine owned. And there would be blood splatter found everywhere on all of the walls. There would be pools of blood. He would have been chased through the house, which is why there was thought to be blood on the doorknob, as though he almost got out but then was drugged back in. And the whole place was a crime scene. It was not just one small part of the home. When John was no longer fighting back, when he was already deceased, Katherine did what she had learned from her job at the slaughterhouse, where she had worked for many years. She then skinned him in one piece, and it was basically described as a suit of skin. And then she drug his body, the rest of it, where she wanted it, and she hung up this meat skin on a meat hook in the kitchen. She decapitated his head and put it in this pot. And then she began to take strips of the meat on his bones and make them into little pieces of steak. She made them small enough so they would fit into the stew that she was making, and then she took the remainder of his body and she placed it at his usual chair at the kitchen table and crossed his legs. At this point, she cleaned herself up and went into town and took money out of the bank, out of his account. She came back and she took a whole bunch of pills trying to overdose, or at least that's what they believed. However, thankfully she wasn't successful, and now she was in custody. But what kind of mother and girlfriend could do this? Why would she do this? And another question was, where was the money she took out? Because they found that it had been taken out, but it was nowhere in their home. Who had she given it to? John's family was just as confused. They were horrified, but they didn't understand, because they had always seen Katherine as this super charming, kind, loving woman who was, of course, their family member's girlfriend, who lived with him and often met with the family. However, when they started to really think about it, they realized that things were strange about Katherine, and they weren't wanting to pick up on it, or just didn't think about it in that way. Because they said that, they had met Katherine's family as well, and that they were really rough around the edges. And that Katherine would often have these mood swings where she would very drastically change her behavior from being calm and humming and, dancing around the house to being so angry that she couldn't control herself and that you pretty much should run from her. It was so drastic, and you never knew which side you were going to get. During these rages, many said that Katherine got this strength about her that she normally didn't have, that she could lift anything or anyone, and she also had muscle from working at the slaughterhouse and having to move all of these animals about. But on a normal basis, she was just, kind of an average woman, unless she was possibly hiding her strength, because when she got angry, it just seemed like she suddenly went from this woman of average size, of average strength, to this bodybuilder who worked out 7 times a week. Yet Katherine was now claiming she had nothing to do with the murder, even though it was in the kitchen in the home she was sleeping in. Katherine had a dark past, darker than most people would expect from a beautiful, loving suburban mom who loved to participate in the activities that her children did, who had a loving boyfriend that no matter how much they fought would still want to get back with her. She seemed to have it all together. She had a job that she really enjoyed, even though most wouldn't say that they would enjoy something like that. But beneath this surface level of her mind was a darkness that many wouldn't even be able to fathom. She also had a history of love interests that were much luckier than John Price. But they also had experience with Katherine's dark side. Now let's go back a little bit into Katherine's past and see where this all started, if we can even pinpoint it. It was said that she was born in 1955 in Tinterfield with a twin named Joy. Katherine was actually born into a scandal because her mother had cheated on, her mother's name was Barbara, and she had cheated on her husband, Jack, whom she had 4 children with. And she actually got pregnant with this man that she had cheated on Jack with, named Ken. And Ken Knight got her pregnant with these twins. And they ended up running away together and leaving all 4 of her children with Jack, her ex-husband. She had met this new guy, Ken, through her husband because her husband used to work with him. And so rumors were spreading in this town, and they basically couldn't get away with the fact that everybody knew what had happened, and so they moved to get away from it all. Katherine and Joy were, having a great childhood, and then at the age of 4, their 4 siblings actually had to move in with them because their mother's ex-husband, Jack, had passed away and they had nowhere else to go. Unfortunately for these 6 children, her new husband was not necessarily thought to be a great father or husband. He was an alcoholic who would try to hurt and sexually assault his own wife when he was drunk. and he was thought to possibly assault Katherine. At school, Katherine, growing up, was known to be a bully who would terrorize the small children and do anything she could to hurt them. She was also not afraid to be mean to teachers. She would physically harm them if she could, and she felt no remorse about it. Because of this, she didn't make any friends, and she actually dropped out of school without knowing how to read or write at 15 years old, where she went to work at a clothing factory. However, that is when her dream job would open up, and she would be working with her father Ken in the slaughterhouse. She would get a job there, and she would tell everybody she had never been happier in her life, especially when they gave her her own set of knives. Her job was to cut the internal organs out of animals, and coworkers actually said they hated watching her work because she would cut the arteries just to watch the animals bleed. She would quickly learn everything she needed to know about all of this. Little did her employers know that she would later on be using this on humans as well. While working there, Katherine's life was actually falling into place. When she was 19, she actually met a man named David Kellett in 1974, and this would be her first marriage because they felt that they should get married. It was said to be a very tumultuous relationship, and nobody could really tell who, the worst partner was. They were pretty awful to each other. And David was said to be a truck driver, but he was also an alcoholic, just like Katherine's father, and he often liked to get in fistfights with her. But it was also said that Katherine didn't fear this. In fact, she loved it when he would try to fight her because she would fight back. And like I said before, she had this extraordinary strength, and she would often beat him. And at that point, he started to get scared of her. David's mother had actually told him prior to their marriage that he shouldn't marry Katherine because she had a screw loose somewhere. He soon saw what his mother was talking about when Katherine started to choke him during their wedding night because he had sex with her 3 times, and she had heard from her mother that her mother had done it 5 and wanted to, beat her or be equal, and that's what she thought was supposed to happen. And she was so angry at David for not satisfying her that she started choking him. David was already asleep when this happened, and it woke him up, and he thankfully fought her off and he survived. But then he had to come to terms with the fact that he just married this woman and had to be with her. David said that anytime he tried to, stand up for himself with any of Katherine's family members, Katherine would get really mad. She would actually beat him, and this was sometimes with an iron, sometimes with a skillet over his head. Other times he would wake up with a knife to his throat, and he just never knew what he was going to get with her if he spoke up. They did, however, have 2 children together, and David, being a truck driver, didn't spend a lot of time at home, so Katherine was kind of home with her 2 children on her own, and David kind of used his job as a getaway. They had been together 10 years at this point, but neither of them were really trying to get out because it was thought that it would be far more difficult to try to leave than just to stay in this toxic relationship, which is not true. Katherine started to suspect that he had women that he was going to see and that he was cheating on her while working. And even though David denied all of this, Katherine didn't believe him. Although it was probably a good thing that she didn't believe him because he was having affairs. And one night he actually simply left Katherine and their 2 daughters and went to be with this woman. This would lead Katherine to have a nervous breakdown. She decided she knew exactly what to do to get David back, and she was going to use their 2-month-old daughter to do so. She was said to put her daughter on the railroad tracks, and another person actually saved the baby, thankfully, before the train could come. But that is how she wanted to get the attention of David. The death, the murder of her child. During that time, she also threatened people with an axe, and she took their other child out into public one day in a stroller and was kind of thrashing it about on the road. She was wailing and she was acting very violent, and lots of people actually called the police on her, thinking that, someone needed to help her, and she was put into a psychiatric hospital. There she was diagnosed with postnatal depression and put on antidepressants. And she wasn't kept for long, but she had told a nurse something that was very concerning, and that was that she had intended to kill a mechanic. And why would she do this? Well, because he had been the one to fix her boyfriend's car and that was ultimately why he could leave her. Not because of the woman that he was with, but because of his mechanic. But what I didn't tell you was, at this point David had come back. He always did. They were never apart for too long, and so she had David in her grasp now, but she was still angry that he had left her before. And he was the one to go and pick her up from the hospital when she was discharged, but this wouldn't be the end of her strange behavior. 24 hours later, she would be at a neighbor's house, knocking on the door and asking them for help because her baby was sick and needed to go to the hospital. Now, they drove her back to her baby at her house, which I don't know why you would leave the baby, but regardless, they drove her back. They picked up the baby, and that is when one of the daughters that was in this family that was taking her to the hospital tried to help with the baby, and Katherine would cut her face with a knife she was holding. The family, of course, was terrified, but then they were taken hostage in their own car and told to drive to David's mother's house. And they did so. However, on the way, they begged Katherine to let one of their sons go because he had asthma and this wasn't good for his lungs, and she actually did let him go. They parked at a gas station, and he got out of the car and immediately ran to get help. And hearing this, Katherine was really angry, and she kind of got out of the car and was swinging around a bar type thing, and she was trying to hurt people, and that is when the police actually came and took her back to a psychiatric hospital, but she checked out after 1 day. Soon after this, David and Katherine separated for good this time. David completely wanted nothing to do with her, and she went into kind of a state of distress for quite a long time, but 6 years later, she was ready to put herself out on the market again. Unfortunately for all the men. She was ready to move on in 1987, and this time it was to a local miner named David Saunders. Yep, it was another David, so we'll go by Saunders. That's what we will refer to him as. And they would quickly move in together, and actually Saunders would move in with Katherine and her 2 girls, and he absolutely loved her 2 girls and, was head over heels for them and, being a fatherly figure to them. The only thing was, Saunders refused to get rid of his own apartment. He still wanted to have it just in case anything happened, and Katherine hated this. She saw it as a sign of, disrespect, that he wasn't serious about the relationship, and it really bugged her. She started to get extremely jealous and began to say that he was cheating on her, just as she had done with the other David. At this point, she just kept talking about it, and Saunders was saying, "I'm not cheating on you," but she wouldn't believe him. They actually had a baby together, and, as having a baby never does, the relationship didn't mend. It only got worse. And so now they had 3 little girls in a very toxic household and were often fighting. To get back at Saunders, he actually had a 2-month-old puppy, and I won't get into what she did because I didn't want to hear it, and I'm sure you don't want to either, but it was horrific. And that is the way she got back at Saunders, for just making her upset. She took the life of his puppy. Did it right in front of him to show him what he was capable of, and then after having their baby, she actually tried to kill him with scissors. She also went and cut up all of his clothing in his closet, and so the only clothes he had was what was on his body at that point. And with that, Saunders said enough was enough, and he actually left her right then and there. Now Katherine was single once again, and she was scouting for her next boyfriend or victim. And although she at this point was claiming that Saunders was actually the abusive one, and that he had hit her during pregnancy in the stomach, and that he was the one abusing her, and that she wanted to get a restraining order so he couldn't come near their daughter, which was also his daughter. Saunders claimed that these were all pure lies, and I never like to say that a person who is saying that they have been abused is lying, because there are so many times when they don't even have the strength to say that, and so if they did finally, come forward, you wouldn't want to make them feel like they shouldn't have. But what I'll say is that we can't confirm whether he was abusive, but we can confirm that she was, and that she did kill the puppy, and Katherine wasn't near the innocent that she liked people to believe. The next man, the unfortunate soul to fall for Katherine next, was a man named John Chillingworth. They had a child together as well. They were more of a sexual relationship than romantic ever, and this was actually her first boy. And so this added to her 3 girls, and she now had 4 children. And it was the same sort of relationship with Katherine and John, and they fought all the time, got physical, and Katherine was said to smash his teeth. He had fake teeth. She smashed those to bits, and she also smashed his glasses. She blamed John for being the violent one once again. However, she didn't have any stories to kind of back this up. She couldn't even say a time when he had harmed her, which again, could just be that she was scared to say. So we can't really speak on that part of it. And if he did, that was Katherine's 3rd relationship that was extremely toxic, and nobody deserves to go through that. She didn't, the men didn't, because I do want to say that that's exactly what happens when, especially domestic abuse survivors, try to speak out. If they're dealing with a narcissist, that narcissist is really good at twisting the truth and making you feel like they are the victim in this. And then again, that could be the men in all of her relationships, or it could be her. She could be the one who's making it seem like she is the one who didn't do anything. I think in this case, toxic relationships were present wherever Katherine was, and that doesn't mean she was the only abuser, that doesn't mean she was the only innocent one, and in fact, I almost want to believe that everyone was in these scenarios, that it was just an all-around horrific ordeal that many kids shouldn't have had to deal with. Now, these all happened before John Price, and that's why many people didn't have a hard time believing that Katherine was now in custody for his murder. But what they didn't know is how disturbing the murder actually was, and what I didn't tell you about Katherine and John's relationship is that Katherine really wanted to get married, and John basically said no every single time she asked. She now had 4 children as a single mother, and she wanted to have a husband, and he just wasn't giving that to her. She also wanted him to basically sign over part of the control of his home to her, and he said no. My will is everything's going to go to my children no matter what. They had an on-again and off-again relationship, and at one point, Katherine got so mad at John that she wanted to ruin his life, and she basically did. You see, he had found these first aid kits at his job that he had brought home because they were either expired or something had happened and he had brought them home. He wasn't supposed to bring them home, but they weren't useful, so it didn't really matter, and he kept them at his home. And Katherine decided to record these items and send it to his boss, who then fired him for stealing them. And this was a job he had been at for 17 years and loved. He then, of course, kicked her out of the house, but then he wanted to rekindle their relationship a few months later and let her back into his life. The only thing he said was that she wasn't going to be staying at his house, like permanently, but she could still come over. That's when neighbors of John said that the violence of Katherine towards John just worsened, and his friends started backing away from him once again. Anytime Katherine was out of the picture, they would really get close to John again, but she kind of pushed them out of his life anytime they were together, which of course is a horrific sign of a bad relationship. But they were all worried for his safety, and they did not know how right they were about that. 2 nights prior to the murder, the police were actually called to John's residence, and this was actually by Katherine, who would say that John had put his hands on her. And John would say, "I only did so because she was trying to kill me with a butcher knife." And then he asked, "Can you please get her off my property?" And they said, "No, you'll have to go to court for that. We can't just take her off." And he said, "But it's my property." And they said, we can't do anything. You're going to have to get a restraining order," which is what he was trying to do and couldn't in time. It was also found that around this time, Katherine had recorded her belongings on a camera, saying which of her kids would get what thing, kind of like a virtual video will. It was now the night of February 29th, the night of the murder, and John had gotten home that night. And there were things that I didn't tell you about what had happened, because he had walked in and he had found that all of the kids were actually gone. This was quite unusual. Most of the kids were still at his house at all times, and he went to the neighbors to see if they had seen anything, and they said that Katherine had taken them to a sleepover. And now we know why. Katherine then cut up John like she had learned to at her job, and she was said to eat part of him, but it's unknown if she just threw it away and couldn't stomach it, or had eaten a lot more than what people even knew was there and was already full by that point. But why would she have cooked him if she didn't have the stomach to eat him? Everybody calls her Cannibal Kathy, and she was known as a cannibal, but there really wasn't evidence that she ate a ton of him, or that it was for her personal pleasure in a way. It was almost as though it was for his family, who was left plates. I mean, why did this process even cross her mind? Why couldn't she just kill him and leave him there, even though that's horrific to say? But to go the extra mile to cut him up is just, it's hard to even fathom. Because it's not like cooking him covered up his murder, it just made it more prominent, like he was doing a performance of sorts for his children. But she wouldn't even have been able to see when they got home and saw the plates, so why did it matter to her? When she skinned him, it was actually found that she was so good from her job that it just all came off in one piece, except for a tiny spot on his chest where she was said to have scarred him with a knife, almost like she was keeping it there on purpose. Could she have possibly done all the cooking just to get back at the children who were going to get all of his stuff in the will? Is that the main reason why she did all of this? Because she was jealous of them? Because he wasn't cheating on her with another woman, but she felt like maybe he was cheating on her with his own kids? Not giving her enough attention? Is that why? Cannibals are some of the killers that I just don't really want to get into the mind of. The psychology behind them. There's just nothing that I could, understand even a little bit, like we try to understand other killers. It's gross, and especially in the case of Katherine, who didn't even do it for the purpose of ingesting it. Why? Thankfully, though, this MO of a very disturbed killer could not escalate into a serial killer because she was now in custody. During questioning, all Katherine could remember after a little while is that she had sex with John, and then she took some pills for her nerves and fell asleep, and when she woke up, all of this chaos was happening, and that's all she knew. She said everything else was just blank. There was just somehow a skinned man in her home that had been made into a meal. When the courts were getting ready for her trial, they were putting together a jury, but they had to make sure to tell all of them there's going to be graphic material. You do not have to be in this if you do not want to be, and you also can step out of the room if you want to as well. You don't have to look at it, which is quite, strange, because I feel like they would need to see how horrible it was to get a true representation of the crime, but nobody wants to see something like that, so I can understand it at the same time. But in October of 2001, after all this time of Katherine pleading not guilty, she pled guilty. And she said that this was because she wanted to save John's family from the trauma of going through the trial and looking at all of these photos. But why, if she was the one who set this all up for them to begin with? Katherine's exes testified against her, as well as a past psychologist who said she suffered from borderline personality disorder, but they said that she was aware of what she was doing that night, so she could not, plead insanity. Her own brother came forward and said that Katherine had said a few weeks before John's murder that she was going to basically take John out in a way that made her seem crazy. The jury was dismissed, and the judge actually sentenced Katherine Knight to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at 49 years old, and it was also written on her papers never to be released, so there is not a chance she can get out. She is the first and only woman in Australian history to receive that sentence, and John's family actually cheered after hearing this. One of John's children was 14 years old at the time, and actually had to read about all of this in the newspapers to hear what horrific things had happened to her father, and they actually all were written letters by Katherine basically saying that if she couldn't have him, no one could. The judge said that what John went through prior to dying and after was absolutely horrendous, and that if Katherine was let out, she would most likely do it to males again. I do wonder though if it would be men who just cross her, you know, men she thinks cheated on her, ones that she has a close relationship with, or if it would have escalated just to killing because she could fulfill that urge that she felt when she was doing all that to John. You know, if she would become a full-fledged serial killer or just kill her husbands or boyfriends. Thankfully, the world will never know, because even though Katherine tried to appeal her sentence, it was shut down almost immediately. And today she is at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Center, hopefully for the rest of her life. And the fellow inmates there actually call her Nana, as though she's this wonderful motherly figure, even though she was never a great mother to her children. And many today call her the female Hannibal Lecter, which is a horrific thing to be compared to. But, you know, killers like this, I'm not sure we will ever learn from, because I'm so sick and tired of seeing cases like this one where we were so close to getting these people help and we didn't. We failed them. And that's the mental health system. And the amount of time she was at psychiatric hospitals and they just drugged her with antidepressants and let her go. Many said that they never saw her violence or anger, you know, the people who didn't know her closely, or the ones who did said, you know, it was so off and on that we didn't know when it was going to come, and that's the problem, you don't. And so if you can't prepare for it, if you have to be afraid of somebody for one part of them and you don't know when it's going to come about again, that's when they need help. And unfortunately, even when families want that help, a lot of the times they don't get it, because nobody wants to acknowledge that just because they don't look like they need help doesn't mean that they should just be released. I mean, even from her first husband, she showed this sort of behavior, and to her kids, you know, putting their lives in danger, his life in danger. And so many people saw her, but yet didn't do anything to help her. We fail to, even when we have the chance to help, we fail to acknowledge that they can go from here to here. We just want to say, no, they'll stay here. We're sure they'll stay here. You know, just on the brink of a nervous breakdown. They'll never get that bad. And then we're so surprised when they get down here, like we didn't see it up here. It's something that bothers me so incredibly much, that people around them are not listened to. Anyone who saw her chose to look at her calm side and say, look, she's doing better. Let's release her. Instead of looking deeper into and worrying about the side that she was hiding. I'd love to hear your theories on that and how you think we could better it, and just this whole case in general. I'm so sorry it was so graphic, and I'm gonna go block it out by watching something very, very calming. Maybe watch some ASMR, or I don't know, watch some movie that's like a cartoon, because that was a lot, and I'm so sorry. But it had the theme of a mother, so I want to say Happy Mother's Day to all of you good mothers out there, including my own. And you are so incredibly loved, and so we're so grateful for you. Even if, you know, your kids are acting up because they've been in the house 24/7, even if all you get is like a cardboard piece of paper that has boogers all over it, I see your effort, and I see that you're a wonderful, wonderful parent, even if most days it doesn't feel like it. So, yeah. I love you guys so incredibly much. Don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye. Bye.